The ink was barely dry when I realized I'd just signed away more than a marriage. The office air was thick with perfume and arrogance. Hers, not mine. I remember the sound of the rain tapping the glass, steady and cruel, as if the sky itself was mocking me. If you've ever trusted the wrong person, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. You'll understand how silence can hurt more than shouting ever could. My reflection in the window didn't look like me anymore. Just a tired woman who had loved too hard for too long. Let me show you how I became her. It was 2:30 p.m. when I signed the last document that ended my marriage of 38 years. The ink hadn't even dried before I realized what I'd really given away. Not just a house or a name, but decades of myself. The law office smelled faintly of stale coffee and printer toner. The air so still, it felt like even the walls were waiting to see if I'd break. Across the table sat Richard, the man I once believed would love me until our last breath. His face unreadable. Next to him, that young lawyer, Vanessa, barely older than our daughter. Her smile practiced and cold. She didn't look at me as she shuffled the papers, as if I were already something past and done. I wondered if she knew the life she was inheriting, the nights I stayed up balancing books for his business, the years I spent making sure his dreams came true, while mine quietly wilted. My hands didn't shake as I signed. Not once. I think humiliation burns so hot that it eventually turns cold. I remember glancing at the clock, the minute hand moving without mercy, and thinking how strange it was that the world kept going while mine ended. As I stood to leave, my grandfather's voice drifted through my memory. Sometimes you have to lose everything to see what was waiting underneath. I didn't understand it then, but I would soon. When Richard and I first met, we were both 24 and full of plans that barely fit inside our tiny apartment. He dreamed of owning his own construction company. I dreamed of a life built on partnership. We started with almost nothing. A second-hand pickup truck, a rented garage, and a shared belief that love and hard work could conquer anything. I managed the books, took phone calls late into the night, and worked weekends to make sure clients felt cared for. He'd always say we were a team, and for a long time, I believed him. Success came slowly, then all at once. The first big contract, the first new office, the new house on Willow Drive. We had what people called a good life. But somewhere in all that comfort, something shifted. Richard started staying late at work more often, claiming business dinners I was never invited to. His tone became shorter, his patience thinner. He laughed less. I told myself it was stress, that every marriage goes through seasons. But deep down, I felt the distance growing like a quiet crack in the wall. The day I found out about Vanessa wasn't cinematic. No shouting, no broken plates, just an email left open, a string of messages I wasn't meant to see, compliments that used to be mine, jokes that once belonged to our rhythm. I remember feeling a stillness so heavy it made breathing difficult. When the divorce began, the language of love turned into the language of ownership. The house, the accounts, the business, all shifted under my feet until nothing was left with my name on it. My life became paperwork and signatures, erasures made legal. As I walked out of that law office for the last time, I didn't cry. I just felt small, almost transparent, like I had faded out of my own story. And for the first time in my life, I realized no one was going to rescue me. The motel room smelled like damp carpet and cheap bleach. the kind of scent that clung to your clothes no matter how short the stay. The heater made a low humming sound that filled the silence between my breaths. The curtains were drawn, though the light outside still managed to find its way through the cracks, thin lines of gold cutting across the faded wallpaper. That little room became my world for a while, and I don't know which felt heavier, the loneliness or the quiet. I had a few boxes stacked by the door, the last pieces of a life dismantled. Old photographs, tax papers, a few dresses, and a framed picture of my dogs, Daisy and Cooper. I lost them when I lost the house. I remember standing on the sidewalk one evening, watching the porch light flicker on automatically, hearing their muffled barking from inside. I stood there until a neighbor asked if I was okay. I wasn't. I turned away before the tears came. My savings were almost gone. I'd never managed money before. Richard had always handled that. I'd always trusted that our future was something we shared. Now I was counting quarters for gas and skipping meals without realizing it. Days blurred together. The same lukewarm coffee. The same sinking feeling when I woke up. One night, sitting on that stiff motel bed, I stared at my phone for what felt like hours before finding my sister Joanne's number. We hadn't spoken in years. A mix of pride and old misunderstandings had built a wall between us. But I pressed the call button anyway. My voice shook when I left a message, asking if I could come stay for a while. A week later, I boarded a plane to Florida with one small suitcase and a bruised heart. On the flight, a magazine headline caught my eye. A photo of Richard and Vanessa smiling at some charity event. They looked perfect, untouchable. For a moment, I felt that same hollow ache. But then, I looked out the window. The clouds below were soft and endless. I whispered to myself that this wasn't the end of my story. Somehow, some way, I would rise again. Florida felt different, slower, softer, like the world had exhaled after holding its breath too long. Joanne's house sat just a few blocks from the water, a small place that always smelled faintly of salt and lemon cleaner. Our reunion was quiet at first, careful. Years apart don't disappear overnight. But in her spare room, surrounded by seashells and faded photographs, I felt something I hadn't in months. Safety. One afternoon, Joanne brought out a box of old family papers. She said it might keep my mind busy. Inside were birth certificates, postcards, and yellowed receipts from another life. Then I saw it, an envelope with my name written in my grandfather's careful cursive. The paper was fragile, almost translucent at the edges. Below my name, a single line for Maggie. Open when life feels heavy. My hands trembled as I lifted the flap. Inside was a small brass key and a folded note that mentioned the name of a bank I hadn't heard in decades, Gulf Coast Savings. I drove there the next morning, heart pounding the whole way. The bank looked like it hadn't changed since the 60s. Even the sign out front faded by the sun. When I handed the key to the teller, she disappeared for several minutes before returning with the manager. His expression softened as he read the file. The account was real, opened in 1959 by my grandfather, left untouched, and now worth over $8,000. For a long moment, I couldn't speak. I just stared at the figures, feeling the air around me shift. It wasn't just money. It was faith, his quiet belief that one day I would need a way to begin again. And standing there, I finally believed it too. Hartford greeted me with a kind of gray honesty I hadn't known I missed. The air was crisp, the streets alive with the hum of people going somewhere, doing something. My new apartment wasn't much, a one-bedroom on the 4th floor overlooking a small park. But it was mine. The walls were bare, the furniture simple, yet for the first time in years, the space felt like freedom. Each morning began with black coffee and quiet focus. I spent hours at the small desk by the window, researching Richard's company, the one we built together. The ownership had shifted since the divorce, but buried in legal filings and financial reports. I found something interesting: outside investors could purchase shares, and over time, voting power could change. That discovery became the seed of my plan. I met with a lawyer recommended by one of Joanne's friends, a kind man with sharp instincts. Together, we formed a discreet investment trust under a new name, Northbridge Investments. Every week, I used a portion of my inheritance to buy more shares. Slowly, quietly, no one noticed. The same woman Richard had underestimated was now sitting in the shadows of his boardroom, waiting. With each step, I felt a piece of myself return, the calm, methodical part that once helped him build his empire. I cut my hair short, bought a navy suit, and started walking with my shoulders back again. I wasn't that broken woman anymore. I was deliberate, unrushed. That night, I sat on my balcony watching the city lights flicker against the glass. The wind carried the faint scent of rain. My grandfather's words came to me again. Plant your seeds quietly. Wait for harvest time. I smiled, tracing the rim of my coffee mug. Tomorrow, my harvest begins. The glass walls of the conference room reflected the early light of morning, clean and cold. It was 7:30 a.m. when I stepped inside, the faint echo of my heels against marble cutting through the hush of shifting chairs. The board members looked up, polite but wary, unsure why I was there. At the far end sat Richard, crisp suit, practiced smile, and beside him, Vanessa, her youth polished into sharpness. They looked at me like a ghost that had wandered into the wrong story. For a moment, I simply took in the scene. The air smelled faintly of expensive coffee and arrogance. The same room where I had once brought sandwiches during late meetings, unseen and uncredited. But today, I was not invisible. Richard spoke first, though I barely heard him. My focus stayed on the papers in front of me, the ownership summary I had requested as the new majority stakeholder. Northbridge Investments, the quiet name that had changed everything. When I finally spoke, it was calm, steady. I explained that effective immediately, all executive decisions required my approval. The words settled over the table like snow, soft, soundless, and irreversible. The silence that followed was exquisite. Richard's hand froze mid-motion, his smile faltering as understanding dawned. Vanessa's expression cracked, disbelief first, then something closer to fear. I watched them both without malice, only clarity. This was not vengeance. It was balance. Inside, I felt no heat of victory, only the cool steadiness of completion. I thought of my grandfather, his quiet wisdom, his patience. Plant your seeds quietly, he had said. Wait for harvest time. I gathered my papers, stood, and smoothed my jacket. No grand speeches, no need for validation. I walked to the door as their whispers began to rise behind me. The morning sun caught the edge of the glass, blinding and bright as I stepped outside. For the first time in years, I felt light, not triumphant, not angry, just free. The past no longer held me. I had taken back what was mine. not through fury, but through grace. And as the city hummed awake around me, I realized revenge had never been the goal. Peace was. It was weeks after the boardroom meeting when the headlines began to appear. At first, I didn't pay much attention. I had learned to live quietly again. My mornings started with coffee and the soft sound of birds outside my window. The city felt different now, gentler somehow, as if the noise had dimmed. I spent my days reading, walking, and tending to the little garden on my balcony. Small pots of rosemary, basil, and lavender catching the sunlight. Then one morning, while scrolling through the news, I saw their names. Richard Lawson and Vanessa Hart, under investigation for financial misconduct. The company's internal audit had uncovered falsified expense accounts, questionable transfers, and a secret consulting firm registered under Vanessa's name. The same arrogance that once dismissed me had destroyed them. The details didn't matter. What mattered was how naturally the truth had found its way to the surface. There was no joy in reading about their downfall, only a quiet recognition that the world has its own way of setting things right. I felt a faint smile rise, not from spite, but from peace. Justice, when left to unfold in its own time, is rarely loud. It whispers. It waits. That afternoon, I knelt in the soil of my garden, pressing new seeds into the earth. The air smelled of rain. I thought about how every ending begins like this. Something buried, something waiting to grow. I wasn't the woman who lost everything anymore. I was someone who had learned to let go, to trust that truth doesn't need defenders, only time. As the sun dipped below the skyline, I watered the fresh soil and whispered a quiet thank you, not to Richard, or even to karma, but to the long road that had taught me patience. Life balances itself when you stop trying to force its hand. It's been months now since the storm settled. My days are quiet again, gentle mornings with sunlight spilling across the kitchen floor. The soft sound of my dog's paws on the tile. They're back with me now, older and calmer, like I am. Life feels smaller, but it's richer in ways I never understood before. I spend most mornings tending the garden. The rosemary is thriving, the lavender blooming, and every time I water the soil, I'm reminded that healing doesn't happen all at once. It grows, slowly, when you stop fighting the ground beneath you. I don't think about Richard or Vanessa anymore. Their names feel like they belong to another lifetime. What I carry forward isn't bitterness, but the lesson that peace doesn't come from winning. It comes from letting go. My grandfather's gift wasn't just money. It was his belief in me, his quiet reminder that even when life strips you bare, there's still a seed of hope waiting to be found. I used to think I lost everything. Now I know I was being cleared for something better, something truer. Revenge fades, but peace stays. And with peace comes the kind of freedom no one can take away. So if you're listening to this, maybe nursing your own heartbreak or betrayal, I hope my story reminds you that it's never too late to begin again. Life has a way of restoring what's been taken, but only once you stop chasing what broke you. Have you ever faced something that almost destroyed you, but somehow led you to something better? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone,